Welcome to the video on rethinking, reflecting, and reimagining coaching. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, please subscribe and become a member to the channel. So the first idea here is about limiting feedback. Limit feedback. Feedback doesn't have to be immediate, and your words end up meaning much less than the environment. So basically what I'm trying to say is that conventional wisdom, conventional teaching tells us give feedback right away so the player is going to understand exactly what you're talking about. The feedback is very specific so they can make their correction. I actually don't think that that's appropriate in a number of settings, and here's why. You want the player to have a general idea of what the game is about and kind of what strategy they might want to be leaning towards, but you have to give them the freedom to figure it out on their own. If they're unsuccessful, give them time to figure out solutions of how to be successful. If you're constantly stopping things and giving feedback all the time, then you might even be constraining the players because the players are going to be like, oh, coach said this, coach said that, and if I don't do it this way, he's going to stop the exercise again. So even without knowing it, you might be constraining and limiting your player's ability and at least limiting their chance to explore ideas of how to be successful in the exercise. After the exercise is done, why can't you give a little feedback after? Does it really need to be immediate? This next slide talks about measurable objectives. So if you're going to put together a session, do you really need measurable objectives? And what type of measurable objectives, if you do need them, how are you going to create those? What's the data behind those? So let's use the 6-second rule. Hey, we got to win the ball back in 6 seconds. Every time you do it, it's a success. Every time you don't, it's a failure. I completely disagree with that. Because what if the team that you're pressing had an easy out? What if, they relieved pressure, it was simple, the situation was there, they relieved pressure. Well, you didn't win the ball back in 6 seconds. Well, for me, who cares? Because the fact is that soccer is such a random game with so many possibilities, you're not always going to win the ball back in 6 seconds. So is that data, is that measurable objective even valid? In my opinion, no. Maybe it's better if you say, hey, what was the reaction time of the players who were 5, 10, and 15 yards away from the ball? Did they immediately react to press? Maybe reaction time of those first 3 players is a better measure. So I would be careful of the data and the objectives that you're creating. And then I would say, does everything really have to be measurable, and do you really need objectives for everything? Why can't the environment really be the driving factor here and not to be so caught up on the data? The next idea is about drilling and rote training. So does drilling and rote training unlock this incredible creativity? Does it allow you to pick your head up and start to see passing options you never saw? And I would say, to a certain extent, obviously, being comfortable with the ball, yes, it allows you to pick your head up. But rote learning and drilling, for me, is not the answer. In the beginning stage, yes, you learn the technique, maybe you do repetition, some rote training, but after that, you have to start to put whatever you're learning, whatever techniques this is, in game-based trainings so you have real game cues, and then you can adapt the technique maybe 100 different ways in that game that you would never have adapted that technique in a strict drilling or rote training environment. So for me, no, rote learning, drilling is not the answer. It's maybe a small part in the beginning, but after that, for me, it's all about game-based trainings where you learn to add strategy to what you're doing and you learn to adapt the technique in real game-based trainings while you are seeing real game cues and applying everything with real game cues. So this idea is about, say, next play, right? Maybe it's a bad call and you want your players to move on to that next play. Don't get caught in that bad call. But for me, I like the idea, but at the same time, that bad call might lead to some passion and some motivation in these players. And not every player is the same. So as long as the player is able to be fully present in the moment and play and play and play, it's okay if that bad call sits somewhere within that player, buried deep down, to give them motivation. Because remember, everybody is motivated differently. As long as it's not impeding their play in the present moment, it's okay not to forget about it. I watched Man City the other day, and at halftime, the players were still upset about a call that reversed their goal. Okay, at halftime, if they want to be a little bit upset, okay, for me, that's fine. As long as when the whistle blows, they are fully present. But again, you have to respect individual differences, and not everyone's going to fall in line and be able to say, okay, on to the next play. That's not the way, that's not the real world for me. This next idea is based around the fact that soccer is a random, unpredictable, and fluid game. So each player has different abilities and they have different ways to solve problems. If your game model or the way you coach insists on the fact that you, as the coach, have the way to solve the problems your way, if you insist on that, think of all the other great solutions that your players may be capable of that you have now destroyed. So for me, there's things like, hey, maybe it's easy to correct a team's team shape defensively, right? And you're not destroying creativity there. You're just creating a nice, maybe a nice compact defensive shape that's hard to break down. That's fine. But maybe if you're too rigid in the way you coach the team in the attacking third and say these are the three ways we have to break down a low block, at that point, maybe you really are limiting your players' ability to express themselves. You're limiting the solutions available to them because you yourself, as the coach, are being too rigid, and your rigidness to the game plan, to the game model, is constraining your players in a negative way. The last idea here that I'm going to go over in this video is the role of the coach as an evaluator of the team, of the individual. Now, when a coach gives an evaluation, that evaluation is not 100% correct, set in stone, because no coach is the complete, all-knowing, Jesus in a sweatsuit type of coach, right? So it's so important for a coach to maintain open-mindedness, to have humility, to not be a huge ego guy who can't separate himself, herself from their own ego. And all the time, though, you still do have to have some core convictions about the game. So when you're giving feedback to a player, it's so important to not make it personal, to just make the feedback exactly what it is. It's what you observed in the player at that time. And then I always like to say, when I give the feedback, here is what I'd like you to do to improve upon this. But at the end, it is only the way I see it at the moment. And the player could not agree with that, and that's fine. But all I can do is give honest assessment based on what I saw, but I myself am not ever admitting that my way is the only way or the best way. It's just what I can offer at that time.